Skill 1, Activity 3. The objective for students to understand how to partition based on fractional language, introduce students to algorithmic halving and partitioning oddness, divide or partition the rectangle into halves, partition the circle into fourths. So what we're doing here is the students are going to be quite active on this activity because instead of you prompting and asking them things, you're going to ask them to do things. So what you can do first is you can go ahead and you can create your own partitions as like a whole group for a class and say, okay, is this shape right there, is that equal parts or is not equal parts? And of course we know that that would be not equal parts, okay? So you could draw a couple different ones and you could say, all right, what about this right here? Is this equal parts or is this not equal parts? And again, we know that that would be not equal parts, okay? The next thing that you're gonna do is you're gonna ask your kids, you're gonna learn about halving, right? And everyone's familiar, I think, with the paper folding where you fold it in half, fold it in half, and fold it in half again. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna start off with the rectangle and say, okay, what I'd like you to do is cut it in half. So you go ahead and they cut it in half, and that's perfect, and we have it in halves. And then you're gonna tell your students, okay, cut it in half again. So that go ahead and cut the half in half again, and you cut the half again. And now what do we have? We've cut it into fourths. So we went from halves to fourths. And then if we cut each half in half again, we went from halves to fourths to eighths, okay? Now go to the circle, right? And say the same thing. I'd like you to cut it in halves. So they'll go ahead and they'll do their first cut, and they'll cut it in half. And then say, okay, now we're gonna cut the halves in half again. We're gonna go to fourths, so cut it in fourths. So they go from halves to fourths, right? And then you'll say, cut the halves in half again. So every half is gonna be in cut, so it goes halves, fourths, and now we are in eighths. And at this point in time, you can have students experiment with different ones too and have them. And then what you're going to do is what we just did, we partitioned evenness, okay? So 2 and 2 halves and fourths and eighths, and those all are even numbers with even factors, okay? When you have an odd number or an even number with odd factors, it becomes different, okay? So if you go ahead and you say, okay, cut the rectangle into thirds, your students are more than likely going to do something like this. They're going to do the initial cut there and then go like that and be like, okay, it's cut into thirds, okay? And then let's say, but real quick, is that equal parts or is not equal parts? And we know that that is not equal parts. So go back and then they'll go ahead and they'll go like this and they'll do it on the other side. And then they'll have to learn, this is a teaching point, when you're partitioning odd numbers, you can't start off with half because half isn't part of those odd numbers. It's not part of a natural fit for it. So when you're doing odd numbers, you have to almost go through and you have to measure it out. Say like, okay, this would be a third, and that would be about a third right there. And they have to measure it out with their fingers. And then you can say, all right, there's a third and there's a third. Is that equal? Yes. All right. Then you can say, all right, I'd like you to partition the rectangle into fifths. Okay. And again, if they try and cut it in the middle, they're going to realize it's impossible to cut something in the fifths when the first cut is in the middle. So again, they're going to have to go through and sort of visually partition and go through, and they can go ahead and draw the dots and say, all right, that looks about even. Then they can go through and they can put their partitions in like that, okay? And then when you go and you ask them to do the circle, cut the circle, again, cut the circle in thirds. We're going to go ahead and do something like this, and then they'll realize they can't do it. So realize when you cut the circle in thirds, what you have to do is you have to find sort of the middle point right there, and then you have to go through and almost partition it like that peace sign. And it's still very, very difficult to do that. So it may take some trying for them to do, but eventually they'll get it. And so the whole goal of skill 1 activity 3 is for them to learn about doing active partitioning by you saying, all right, cut this into thirds for me, cut this into fifths, cut this into fourths, and realize you can go from halves to fourths to eighths. And then when you partition oddness, which is really, you're going to work on halves, fourths, and eighths, and then you're going to go ahead and work on, thirds and fifths. And then the tricky one, and one that's, a really higher level one, is 6, because 6 can be done 2 ways, right? You can cut it in half, and then what you have to do is measure out the thirds after you cut it in half like that. Or if they really want to try, and they could go ahead and try to measure out 6 too. But the easiest way, because 6 is still an even number, but it has an odd factor, is to go through and then have them do the half and then measure it out that way. So the whole goal is having them learn about that partitioning part, because partitioning is a huge part that they're going to do a lot of things in the future with it. So have them get used to the language, matching the language has 4s, 8s, and work on the partitioning. And then did they draw in equal parts or not equal parts?